Not only was Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. gunned down in hatred, but his mother was as well. It happened on June 30th, 1974. King's mother was shot and killed in the middle of church service. The killer was named Marcus Wayne Chenault, the self-proclaimed Hebrew Israelite who went by the name Servant Jacob. It's a difficult story to hear, but an important one. I'm going to tell you the truth about it right now.
Marcus Wayne Chenault, a 23-year-old black Hebrew Israelite, stood up during the service, approached the pulpit, and opened fire on Alberta King.
At approximately 11 a.m., Chenault allegedly pulled two pistols that he had concealed and began firing both weapons. Mrs. King and Deacon Boykin were fatally injured.
But you did see Miss King wounded.
I did see her wounded after the ambulance had brought her out of the church. And I seen some blood.
That's Miss King.
Chenault claimed he shot up the church because, quote, his God instructed him to do so.
I'm on location in Columbus, Ohio. Alberta King's Hebrew Israelite assassin was a student at Columbus, Ohio at Ohio State University. He boarded a bus from here in Columbus with nothing but murder on his mind. Before he boarded the bus to Georgia armed with two pistols, he had reportedly told people he was going to Atlanta to, quote, meet destiny. Sadly, this would mean the death of Dr. King's mother. But who was she? Alberta Williams King. Mrs. King was born September 13, 1904 in Atlanta, Georgia, to Adam and Jenny Williams. She earned a certificate in teaching from Hampton in Virginia. She married Michael King, a preacher, in 1926. She continued her education and earned a bachelor's degree from Morris Brown College in 1938. As a church mother, she also founded the Ebenezer Choir and served as organist for 40 years. She was serving in that capacity faithfully when she was attacked without mercy by Servant Jacob. The Hebrew Israelite man, who was called Servant Jacob, is better known as Marcus Wayne Chenault. He was a 23-year-old who had attended classes at Ohio State in Columbus, where we are now. At his trial, Servant Jacob later said he sought to kill other black clergy and apparently even had a list. Servant Jacob was an adherent of Hebrew Israelism. His teacher was Hananiah E. Israel of Cincinnati, a Tanakh-only Hebrew Israelite. I once interviewed some Cincy Israelites who were in his sphere of influence.
Many of the things that he learned, Hananiah might have talked about black pastors. We talk about Christianity and Islam and those that believe in these things. And at the end of the day, someone might interpret it. And the teacher Hananiah I heard about would have never told this man to go kill someone. If he really believed that, he would have killed them himself.
Hananiah even said he had tutored Servant Jacob in his Hebrew Israelite teaching. Israel told the New York Times a week after Mrs. King's murder that even Servant Jacob was, quote, a college kid who didn't know anything, end quote, but also that, quote, the boy was brilliant. All I had to give him was the key to open his mind.
He told Dayton Daily, I gave Marcus the key to understanding the scriptures. He awakened from the death of sleep, from the grave of ignorance.
That quote is in an article called I Gave Marcus the Key, published in the Dayton Daily News on July 3rd, 1974. In this interview, Hananiah Israel explained he taught Servant Jacob that black pastors were liars who steal millions of dollars from their followers, leading black people, quote, to their doom. Hananiah E. Israel was also extremely critical of civil rights activists, yet he claimed in interviews he did not advocate violence. Israel said he was shocked and flabbergasted, quote, when he found out that his star pupil had been arrested for the murder of King's mother. Yet he didn't denounce the shooting. Echoing the doctrine of his mentor, Servant Jacob Chenault later said he was motivated for his dastardly deed after concluding that, quote, black ministers were a menace to black people, end quote. In fact, when Martin Luther King Sr. asked Servant Jacob later on why he did this, he replied, quote, because she was a Christian and all Christians are my enemies, end quote. The next day, servant Jacob declared that I am a Hebrew, that's a quote, and quote, I was sent here on a purpose and it's partly accomplished, end quote.
You talked about this Walter guy saying, well, his mission wasn't completed. It wasn't even completed with the one person because he killed not a black Christian pastor, he killed the wife of a black Christian pastor.
Yeah, because he said he wasn't there, but yeah.
Well, if he wasn't there, then you just come back, but you don't kill someone else if you got this from the Most High.
I'm on location at the King Arts Complex in Columbus, Ohio. But what happened on that horrific day? Here's what we know. Servant Jacob originally planned to travel to Chicago to kill Jesse Jackson, but at the last minute, he changed his plan. There he was in Atlanta, Georgia. His new target was Martin Luther King Jr.'s father, but he didn't see King Sr. that day. And since Alberta was closer to him, seated on the organ, servant Jacob ended up deciding to assassinate Alberta instead. This Hebrew Israelite extremist murdered Mrs. King as she sat at the organ in Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. Eyewitnesses testified at the trial that servant Jacob was seated about 4 feet from the organ. Deacon Philip Finch, a longtime church member, was there. He relayed that moment, quote, at a moment during the worship service, when everyone's head was bowed and eyes were closed, us singing the Lord's Prayer was when this horrific event occurred, end quote. Suddenly, servant Jacob stood up and yelled, "You are serving a false god!" Here's another quote from an eyewitness. He was up at the pew in his first movement down to Miss King, and he fired. This from a longtime church member, Jackson Smith. Servant Jacob opened fire with his 2 revolvers and said, "I'm tired of all this," he screamed. He shouted, "I'm going to kill everyone in here." He fired directly at Mrs. King, and she was struck. A deacon who saw it relayed that she simply said, "Oh," after the bullet hit her. He also saw servant Jacob standing up with a pistol, he was armed with 2, remember, and said, "I'm taking over this." Servant Jacob began to fire from 2 pistols while Alberta played the Lord's Prayer on the church organ. Another eyewitness of the family, King III, told reporters that King's mother was, quote, playing, ironically, the Lord's Prayer when she was killed. Sadly, family members witnessed this horrific event. Her grandson, Derek Barber King, was one. Barber King said servant Jacob shot Mrs. King again as she was now on the floor, bleeding and screaming. She died later that day. Servant Jacob continued to fire at the unarmed crowd. Servant Jacob also shot and killed a deacon, Edward A. Boykin. This wicked madman also shot a retired school teacher, Jimmy Mitchell, right in the neck. He was seriously wounded, but miraculously, Mitchell survived. King and Boykin were rushed to Grady Memorial Hospital. King was, quote, barely alive when she arrived at the hospital. Boykin was pronounced dead on arrival. King died shortly after from a gunshot wound to the right side of her head. King and Boykin were both fatally wounded, dying at 69 years old. Mrs. King's death was a major blow to the family. It came only 6 years after her son's assassination. Imagine the great pain of Martin Luther King Sr. as he grieved during the funeral service of his wife, the wonderful Alberta Williams King. Now, at a conference called Faith Over Fear in June of 2024, a panel of survivors, including members of the King family, shared details of that day. Each panelist highlighted how Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. continued to deliver sermons focused on forgiveness and love even after this event. Dr. Angela Ferris Watkins, a granddaughter of Alberta King, said he would also say, "Thank God for what you have left." What happened with the assassin? Chenault, servant Jacob, was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. The sentence was upheld on appeal, but he was later resentenced to life in prison, partially because the King family opposed the death penalty. On August 3rd, 1995, servant Jacob suffered a stroke and was taken to a hospital. On August 19th, he died, age 44, from complications of the stroke. Servant Jacob, Marcus Chenault, was a Hebrew Israelite extremist in Columbus, who, like his leader, saw Christian pastors as enemies worthy of death. This Hebrew Israelite from Ohio was also, like his leader, extremely critical of civil rights leaders, and especially Martin Luther King Jr. So much so that he shot down King's mother in cold blood. Well, even though Hebrew Israelites today, in general, don't advocate assassinating black leaders, they are still active here and present in Columbus, Ohio. We are in front of the IUIC headquarters. Marcus Wayne Chenault, servant Jacob, was a Hebrew Israelite extremist in Columbus, Ohio, who, like his leader, saw Christian pastors as enemies worthy of death. This Hebrew Israelite from Ohio was also, like his leader, extremely critical of civil rights leaders, and especially Martin Luther King Jr. So much so that he shot down King's mother in cold blood. Well, even though they don't advocate assassinating black leaders, extremist Hebrew Israelites are still active and present in Columbus, Ohio. Right now, I'm standing in front of the location for Israel United in Christ, an avowedly separatist Israelite group abbreviated IUIC. IUIC is known for their staged, elaborate marches and chants and for their distinctive purple and gold outfits. They, like servant Jacob, are also known for banging on Dr. King.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., his I Have a Dream speech was a lie. He thought we had to integrate and come together and ask to be equal civilly with the people that enslaved his forefathers. God never called us to do that. Christ said the same thing. He said we are not to be equal with them. Christ was a separatist, meaning a nationalist. We came through black pastorship that taught you white mastership. That I have a dream that one day little black boys and little black girls will come together in hands. That's not what the Lord commanded us to do. Did Martin Luther King Jr. prophesy lies in God's name? Lies. God never said for all nations to come together, for us to rejoice with our enemies and try to be equal. And God never said that. The dream that God had for us is for us to rule the earth. To make us, we are better than all people. You're going to find you should have a separate bus. Your bus was better than their bus. Read.
Did you hear the bigotry in those clips? You hear the proud affirmation of straight up racial supremacy? You hear the direct denouncement from what King advocated and supposedly were based upon the Bible? If you didn't hear it the first time, here's a few more clips from the leadership and members of IUIC.
And the fruit that come from their actions is evil. The effects of the civil rights movement has damaged black people worse than any other thing. Now we're transsexual, we're fighting for gay rights. So where did Martin Luther King get the doctrine of joining hands with his oppressor? That everybody can walk hand in hand and be one nation under God. Where did that doctrine come from? Did it come from God? Did it come from Christ? Did Christ teach that? And everybody join hands and be equal, where men are not judged by the color of their skin, but the content of their character. That's not biblical. So if anybody is coming to you with a doctrine of equality, that is not in the Bible, thus saith the Lord. The Caucasian man can never mention the name of Martin Luther King because they murdered him. And that was the grave mistake that he made.
Again, notice where I am. This is a reminder that there still exists a hateful faction within Hebrew Israelism who hates the dream of MLK and claim the Bible promotes ethnic bigotry. This hateful faction is not only here with us in Columbus, it's all over the world, Ohio to Africa, Europe, everywhere in between. Only these days, they don't usually walk into our church services, shoot us in the head during prayer. They now stand outside our buildings, harassing us with heresy and promoting a message which surely leads to spiritual death. Our only option, church, is to now go where they publicly gather, promoting this message of spiritual death, and offer the message of the gospel of Jesus Christ, which is true spiritual life.
Ask your pastor, where is it written to celebrate Mother's Day in the Bible? You're the pastor, so you should be ashamed of yourself, my brother. Don't film our building in your video because that's defamation of character.
What?
If you want to talk about it, go somewhere else and talk about it.
Are you serious right now, bro?
You see what the pastor did? He came out here and he hid behind that wall. They called the police. Hey!
For the cops, what are you doing? Fall back. For the cops. For the cops, what are you doing? Fall back. For the cops.
The pastor came. You see what the pastor did? He came out here and he hid behind that wall. They called the police. Hey!
For the cops, what are you doing? Fall back. For the cops.
What?
For the cops, what are you doing? Fall back. For the cops.
Book of Proverbs, chapter 28 and verse 1. The wicked flee when no man pursueth. I ain't telling you to run, bruh. The wicked flee when no man pursueth. I ain't telling you to run, bruh. Do it. I ain't telling you to run, bruh. The Bible says that the wicked flee when no man pursues.
Why are you running? Why are you running? Why are you running? Why are you running?
He did not come to save one type of person. He came to save sinners.